Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm joined with Josh Wolfe, the co-founder of Lux Capital. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see you, man.
But just to contextualize this, and before I go way back to growing up in Coney Island, could we talk a bit about Lux Capital was at an interesting intersection over the last year. So could you just broadly talk about your experiences this past year running the fund? And it's known to fund and support founders of the early intersections of bio and technology and deep tech, scientific discovery, moonshot businesses. Scientists were developing vaccinations, the venture markets were changing. Could you just talk a bit about those observations and learnings from the past year, year and a half of running the fund and just personally and professionally too?
So it was all very humbling because I had forecast in March or maybe late February, right on the eve when things were really imminently getting shut down, that we were about to see a trove of special situations, that we were going to see an incredible opportunity of late stage businesses that we would be able to invest in at early stage prices. So that was from the fund perspective. I thought that the proverbial stuff was going to hit the fan, and I thought there was going to be a denominator effect from limited partners. There was going to be an under allocation of illiquid investments following what I think was a period of overinvestment into illiquids and venture and private equity. So I thought it was like a great setup, and we had a lot of dry powder. And then I also wanted to make sure that we were admonishing our companies to have really sound balance sheets, so they had effectively war chest to be able to weather a storm. And then that seemed to be the evident case for about 2 weeks when the public market started to have a downdraft, north of 20%. And then after that 2 weeks, we went into this epic period of seasonal FOMO that has persisted ever since. The capstone for us was around that time you started to see the SPAC phenomenon. And this was, for us, like the backwater of finance, and we had zero interest in participating. I used to joke that, SPACs were typically at these like B minus C plus investment banks that had like Pitbull and Snoop Dogg performing, and it was just like a negative indicator of the quality of the companies that were likely to participate. What happened was you started to get some legitimate sponsors that were participating in this vehicle. Part of that was driven by what many people don't know are some of these what people call the SPAC mafia, but ARB funds that were basically borrowing 10 to 1 from Canadian banks and buying into the SPACs, relatively indifferent about what the underlying companies were, and then figuring out that they can get a relatively high cash yield by participating in those things. And then that sort of set off this movement. One of our companies, Desktop Metal, approached us and said, we're thinking about doing this. And our first admonition was like, no, stay far away, right? But then as we learned more, and then we saw the quality of the sponsors and the PIPE participants, that set off. We ended up having 8 companies, I think, that have either de-SPAC'd or in the process of doing that. We ended up launching our own SPAC, Lux Health and Tech. And so I would say that really was humbling in the mindset change from viewing something with such negative valence to something that we then actively participated in to capitalize our companies or capitalize on this phenomenon. And we've done it still with like a skeptical eye towards what is going on, and I have a view about how this evolves. But so that was number one in terms of professionally humbling, not in, my God, everything that we thought was going to go right was going wrong, but the antithesis. We thought, or at least a subset of us thought everything was going to go wrong, and it just went amazingly right. The other thing was thinking about the internal conversations that we historically have had. On balance, there was always good news from some new portfolio companies, and usually we're most excited about the companies that have nothing but blue sky. They're getting, started out. It's the hero's journey. It's just beginning. Nothing but, opportunity and possibility ahead. And of course, the companies that, are 1, 2, 3, 4 years, have done their Series B or C, those are the ones that have internal coups and departures and target misses and higher expectations from investors that came in at higher valuations. And so, but every conversation that we had on our partners meetings was a positive conversation. Every company was doing an up round. Every company was able to hire and recruit talent that they, previously sought and wasn't giving them at the time of day. And so everything was going right. And my admonition on this was like, yes, let's take this in and enjoy this moment, but let's remember it wasn't always like this. And it won't be like this.
Right.
And whether this lasts for 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, I have no idea. But just sort of keeping the psychic, mental, and then also the financial reserve that if and when the stuff does hit the proverbial fan, of which I've been wrong in forecasting for the past 2 years that it would, that we would be competitively advantaged to others who might feel more surprised. So that was sort of the second thing. Third thing was, keeping the team together. Half the team was always in New York, half the team was Menlo Park, so we already had, a remote team, right? But the local teams that disbanded and, went to be with families or, seek safety or comfort, that was a lot harder. Doing entrepreneurial interviews, deals, hiring, we hired 2 people which were the first two people we've ever hired in the firm's history without ever meeting them in person. And so that was a very weird, strange feeling and dynamic to not literally be able to be with a human. Assessing entrepreneurs through video at a time where the fungibility of dollars, were effectively, infinite, right? It didn't matter whether you were taking Lux's money or somebody else's money. The ability for an entrepreneur to not have to be localized and do 10 meetings, but to jump on, 5 Zooms. You just saw this frenetic pace that was picking up, and then our ability to diligence entrepreneurs. Everybody has different lenses at Lux through which they look at things. It might be technical diligence or market diligence or, assessment of their storytelling ability. And I really like to assess a founder almost like a poker player and looking at their little, physical tells. And if one founder is making some bombastic, really ambitious statement, and then, his or her co-founder is like looking at them and they give that sort of throat swallow, and it's to me a sign of a question of the credulity of what that person was saying. Like there's little body language in this 3-dimensional mosaic that got compressed into the 2-dimensional screens. And so there was a lot of psychological sort of loss in the information ratio. So interestingly, we just had one of our first entrepreneurs come and give us an update in person, and the New York team was here, and the West Coast team in Menlo Park was on video, and they were more frustrated because they were looking at a conference table instead of being able to. So for them, it was even worse, and from being conditioned to at least seeing individual faces. So we're thinking about what do you
and
do?
Are there right? And the qualities of the founders, since this is called Finding Genius, and you're thinking about the genius of the entrepreneur, you've been in venture for over a decade and doing this and backing really interesting entrepreneurs. Did your perspectives on genius or the qualities of what would make an entrepreneur thrive in this sort of uncertain time change? Did your lens, or has it been pretty constant over that time in your thesis and perspective on founders?
It's a great question. I think it has been constant, which is to say that the patterns that we've used to recognize what we thought were going to be exceptional people have not really changed, which is not to say that they're accurate patterns, but our own patterns that we developed. And so, there's a range of people, some of whom are incredible salespeople, right? And some people can command a room. And so if they're talking on Zoom, it might be harder to read the room. It might be harder to sort of riff or use their body language. Like when I speak, I gesticulate wildly. I don't know right now if you can even see my hands, right? They're fevers, like moving, right? But so you have people who are sort of frenetic and kinetic, and they lose a little bit of that. There's people who are more introverted that might be brilliant, but sometimes almost like they have spectrum type disorder, which sometimes can be a positive, and they might not be making eye contact or looking down. And so some of that is a pro and con because they might actually feel more comfortable behind a screen, not feeling the judgment of a human and that sort of weight of somebody's body temperature in the room looking at you, and even catching that. Some people are very self-conscious. They could feel somebody at the end of the table looking at them, even though. And so I think that the patterns of generally somebody that is thinking differently, knows a space cold, has that what we often consider, or many do, arrogance of the highest order of like, this is not the way that the world should be. It should be this way. And they have a different view with very high conviction. And then that conviction for us translates into a sales ability to recruit and raise money, and gives us the conviction that these people are going to take our money in turn and just do amazing things with it.
When you're talking about this frenetic pace of doing deals, and it seems like there's more funds out there, they're all coming earlier, they're doing seed, everybody's doing healthcare, the valuations just continue to creep upward. How did things change from a diligence standpoint for your team or venture strategy beyond the SPACs of how you were getting into these deals and the types of deals you were all looking at?
So that was something we had to adapt to because we tend to present term sheets in a very cinematic way that's very customized to like every individual partnership. Sometimes they're very creative. And that was something that was harder for us to do. So I felt like we were at a disadvantage because that basically got diluted away. There were founders, as I noted earlier, who just felt that, funds were fungible and that, we had a handshake deal with somebody on a Friday and it wasn't actually a handshake, right? Which I actually think that there's something human about actually shaking somebody's hand. And looking them in the eye.
Right.
And then another firm came in on Saturday morning over Zoom and came in over the top with like a 20% higher offer, and they went with that, and we were just shocked and surprised and lost it on price. So I would say diligence periods got shorter, velocity got higher, so it felt less responsible in many ways. In terms of winning the entrepreneurs, we still operate as what we call unum lux, so lux being Latin for light, unum being one, and so it doesn't matter whose deal it is. Like, my most favorite times at Lux are when we are all fighting together as a team. And typically you're fighting to win the entrepreneur, either, absolute and objectively or relative to another firm. And that's something that, we look at a lot. It's like if we lose, there's a handful of firms or people that we understand we might lose to because of reputational or preference. But there's other firms that we used to lose to that we don't anymore, and we don't want to rest on our laurels, but we feel good, like process versus outcome. Like our processes have yielded good results, and so we like winning more entrepreneurs. We like winning with our entrepreneurs, but I love a sort of a good fight and a good competition.
Right, and because you mentioned price, Lux is funding moonshots. I mean, it's not funding boring typical enterprise SaaS companies that might cap out, but you're funding space manufacturing or biotech and pretty huge opportunities. So when you're thinking about a 20% markup in price, what's that conversation at the partnership level of, okay, do we just match this price or do we try to beat it or we've hit our cap? How do you all think about that when these businesses can become so massive?
It's been rare that we've lost something in a bidding war where, we bid X and then some other firm came over like at 1.2X and they were like, okay, we'll give you 1.3. It's just generally something else aside from the price, right? Like in that particular case where we had a handshake deal on a Friday and lost it on a Saturday morning, like price was a observable thing, but there was probably other stuff behind the scenes, right? Or they might have just had a preference for that particular partner at that firm versus like the particular partner at Lux that was going to be their lead. So, but when it comes to the moonshots that we do, the most rewarding thing for me is when a company is starting up totally de novo, in part because it's the 0 to 1 phenomenon. The thing doesn't exist, and then it does. In part because it's the power of secret, and I always love that line as Pauline quote that, I know something that you don't know and the rest of the world doesn't know, and they won't know until I tell them. And so that legal inside information, that asymmetry of knowing something the rest of the world doesn't, it's quite addictive feeling, actually. And then the third thing is you get to sort of control price, because if you are coming to the entrepreneur, the scientist, and the inventor and saying, like, let's start something, it's very rare that they would be like, that's a great idea, let me go shop this around, right? There's a conviction and and we always like to say that we believe before others understand, and that's a great presentation of that. So usually their valuation is not an issue. It's more working hand in hand with the entrepreneur or the founder to say, how do we construct the perfect founding round so that you can achieve a lot in secret? And then when we go out to raise, if we don't already know the parties that we're going to go to syndicate, that people just go wild about it. So you take a company like Icon, there's a breakthrough in cutting edge microscopy based on Nobel Prize winning work of Eric Betzig. This was in stealth for 2+ years. And I think it was a $15 or $20 million seed round that us and another firm did. And then when it all came together, it ended up as a Series A of about $160 million, split, roughly 3 ways. Huge check for us, huge bet of conviction, totally in secrecy. But there, we weren't worried about somebody else coming over the top and being like, hey, I'll pay 30% more or something. Like it was
interesting.
Even though we didn't have formal legal control, it was effectively, tacit control, of the opportunity.
It's a partnership with the founder, right? Totally. So I actually listened to an interesting podcast of yours recently where you talked about growing up in Coney Island, and it's pretty atypical from the Silicon Valley stories that we hear. And we talked about this in the prep call also of growing up in New York. Can you talk a bit about growing up in Coney Island and the melting pot of that community? And then now you're involved with the Coney Island chartered school system. But one thing that you said that was very interesting is that you have an aversion to social statuses when kids are wearing Jordans and then other kids are feeling like those are the heroes that they have to aspire towards and work towards. And in this school that you're working with is you're trying to change the heroes that kids look up to. Could you talk a bit about that and the heroes that you were growing up with that led you into investment banking, but then towards Lux and the types of businesses you're investing in? I think that transition would be interesting for people to learn from.
So Coney Island, by the way, this is
there it is.
A cyclone. This is a scale model. This is the world's scariest roller coaster.
This is more stable than the actual one, right?
Exactly. No, and that's why it's not by virtue of its height or its speed or its descent, but it is so old. Your ride may be the last, and that's the thrill of it. But this to me is like the great metaphor of life, of venture, of markets. The difference obviously here is this is parametrically constrained, right? Every single time it's going to go on the same track, and obviously there's the uncertainty of death and injury, which you feel whiplash, but. And that's the one distinction with real life, but the ups and downs, right, and the thrill and the fear of going into something, and so I've ridden that hundreds of times now, and I grew up a block and a half from it, so it's just a metaphor for me. That was a very important thing. Coney Island itself is truly a melting pot in New York, and You've got, black, white, Latino, Russian emigres, Pakistani, Iranian, like, it really was like the Ellis Island, of Brooklyn. It's where everybody came to sort of mix, and you go on the boardwalk and you can see, Puerto Ricans breakdancing and Hasidic Jews, coming out of their Shabbos, and it's just this pastiche of New York.
Amazing,
And they
right?
don't necessarily hate, like, the Hasidic Jews are not breakdancing, and the Puerto Ricans are not davening, but like there's just this mix that you just see all these cultures in a way that I've just never experienced anywhere. And in part because there's these transient cultures, in part because so many people are coming and are poor in these areas, there's just a big hustler culture. And so somebody's always got a scheme or an agenda, and it's almost like a metaphor of the sideshow Carney games that you see, right? Like anybody that plays those games is a sucker. Now you might play it for entertainment in the same way that you might gamble, but like they're negative expected odds to the nth degree, right? It's not just like playing blackjack where you know what the house's edge is. Like you don't win in these games, right? There's a reason that they exist. And so like on occasion, they give you the big pink teddy bear. So like, and ring bells, but it's a hustle. And so I grew up very sort of squinty-eyed and skeptical of everybody. I got mugged 3 times when I was in junior high. You don't trust. You don't make eye contact. And so very early on, I think it was in junior high or high school, freshman year or something, there was a Shakespearean quote which became my favorite, which was that there's daggers in men's smiles. And I've always since then had this perennial optimism in the truth of science and technology, and a great skepticism, if not cynicism, for human nature. And part of that I realized is because there's an intellectual competitiveness when you can spot somebody who is a con man or a fraud, and you see the trick that they're doing. And part of you feels righteous because you want to protect their prey, and part of you wants the intellectual status because that itself is a game to be like, no, I'm on to you. And I realize like whether it's public markets where I call certain people out, or the fear I have of being duped, if an entrepreneur, God forbid, like Elizabeth Holmes walks in a Theranos type thing and we fall for that kind of thing. The aversion that I have viscerally to being conned and to being able to detect people probably over-indexes me to think that more things are frauds or BS than they are as a protective mechanism. But I just find that that's, sort of a healthy skepticism. Now, at Lux, if everybody was like me, we'd be a bunch of sort of cynical short sellers. And so you need Peter and, Bilal and Shaheen and Zav and AG and Dina and Brandon who have a modicum of optimism that, are more pro-social. Coney Island itself.
That's very interesting.
I grew up single mom, school teacher. She taught special ed. My grandfather, we lived at, 1.5 bedroom, 1 bath apartment, 4 people. Grandpa delivered the Daily News at night. Grandma was a retired meter maid. Mom taught special ed. And so I had no money. I had friends, that had like a house, which to me was wealth. And I wanted money, and I didn't want to be poor. And I also believed and was told by my loving mother and grandmother that I was very intelligent. And so that was like a big self-esteem, but they also had very high expectations for me. Now, the expectations for a kid growing up in Coney Island, Brooklyn, were like, either go work locally, or in my mom's case as professional was like, go be a doctor or a lawyer. And that was the path. Like I was going to go be a doctor. And then I started doing scientific research in high school, and my mentor was trading futures and options, and I didn't know what the heck stock market was, or like sales and trading versus investment banking. I knew none of this, but I got turned on to that. And then I got very lucky in that these sort of forces aligned between an interest in science, which is this endless frontier of just constantly pushing in creativity and curiosity, driven not in my view, and maybe this is my cynical interpretation, by people that truly want to save the world, but by the status seeking of the scientist, that wants to get famous or wealthy for having discovered something, and all the accoutrements that come from that, and wanting to make money. And so venture capital to me is this perfect hybridization between science and finance, and I feel very lucky. In Coney Island, it's mostly Black and Latino population, a lot of immigrants, and people that came from the Caribbean, West Indies, and Haiti and Jamaica. And, I grew up on hip-hop and basketball and heavy metal too, but I resented very much when like Puffy and Jay-Z and like rappers in the 90s who had made a ton of money would come into the neighborhood and effectively, at a concert or something, and be like, keep it real, which was basically a euphemism for maintain the status quo and buy my stuff. None of them were revealing like, here's my playbook, here's how I market, here's how I create an audience, and here's how I monetize that audience. It was almost like predatory. And so I thought if you could flood the zone with heroes where those heroes are, and I remember like kindergarten, there was, in Canarsie, Brooklyn, there was this border all around the room, and it had, like astronaut, scientist, teacher, like these images of people that were
Yeah,
almost like
yeah.
emojis. And it's just like, okay, like there's something besides a teacher or a newspaper delivery man, like, at least on a picture, but just exposing you to heroes. And particularly if you grow up in Coney Island in the projects, if the most famous and celebrated people are rappers and ball players, and the odds of you being Stephon Marbury or Biggie are like infinitely low, then you want to inspire with amazing people who might look like you as Black and Latino boy or girl, that are scientists, entrepreneurs, producers, people that are encouraging production, that are of value to society as opposed to just consumption via entertainment. And so I used to just sort of rant that. And then somebody introduced me to this young social entrepreneur, Jacob Mnookin, who was starting a school, and he had looked at a map of New York City and basically was like, okay, there's a white space, just like we do when we're scouting out a new thesis in a technology sector. And he's like, there's a bunch of charter schools in North Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in Harlem. There's nothing in South Brooklyn. And so he decided to start a school called Coney Island Prep, and somebody introduced me, and I'm like, I'm in. I joined the founding board. Everybody else took a step back. I became chairman. That was 12 plus years ago. We started with 90 kids in the projects in fifth grade, and then backfilled, and now we're K through 12, 3 different facilities, 1,000 plus scholars, 180 staff, 100% college acceptance.
Wow.
It feels great. It feels great. And
Wow.
and these are people who, in the John Rawls sense, lost the ovarian lottery. 80% of our kids come from a family of 4 that makes $25,000 or less, which, I get chills like thinking about, like, that's insane.
Yeah. Right.
And they are at the poverty level, and many of them are
That's
brilliant,
very
like brilliant kids
Right.
that, just given the right opportunity and the right expectations, are going to go do great things.
And how does your perspectives on education, especially socioeconomically, and the way Silicon Valley is always knocking on college and university, and you're saying 100% college acceptance rate, how do your perspectives diverge, just given the way that we grew up in the public school system or in New York? Do you find that they're very divergent with the other VCs and the way Silicon Valley or tech thinks about education more broadly?
Well, they can coexist, which is my own views. I don't care if my kids go to college. I've got 3 kids, 11, 8, and 5, and I don't care, but they're born into privilege. And so it's a very different situation. And I didn't know anybody when I was growing up, and now I know a lot of people. And it should be all meritocracy, but for them, they have an unfair up-leveling. For other people that don't know anybody and have no embedded network, and remember, I was a kid that, like, I had no idea what sales and trading or investment banking were, but like most of these kids, they have no idea any of this stuff, like venture capital, private equity, And so I just think college is relevant to let you have symbolically this experience for at least a year or two where you're like, I can get out of where I came from. And there are a lot of pressures. It's not just like, there is culture shock where you go and you're the first to attend college and you see wealth, and that might make you bitter, and it might make you motivated, or it might make you feel totally dejected and alone and depressed. And so it's very hard, from that dimension. But the hiring practices of most companies, even if you're like, okay, I want to go work at a bank, or I want to go, to med school, or like the prerequisite requirements curricularly for academic achievement is the one legal way that hiring employers can discriminate against people. And so college is really sort of, in a sense, is this sort of institutional mechanism of discrimination, both pro and con. And people who have a college degree are able to get a higher starting salary. Now, I do think, whether it's the efforts of Silicon Valley or technology or just people generally, that will start to get diluted over time, that it will matter less and less. And it might take 2 generations. I think it's probably naive and idealistic to assume this can happen in the next 5 or 10 years. But the idea of state schools, even if you look at like upstate New York, SUNY Oneonta and Geneseo and Albany and Binghamton, like these all existed when there was tons of industry there, and people couldn't really have mobility and move and fly and take trains, and all that's changed. And so do you really need as many colleges as you have? Do you really need 30 or 3,000 simultaneous physics 101 classes, or could there be 3 incredible ones for 3 different stylistic ways of learning? And so I think that things will trend that way. But in the meantime, before we get to that sort of ideal state, you have a lot of inequity, and people still need the signaling value for society who is making decisions based on credentials. And so, in the same way that controversial hires like Koch Industries are basically saying that we will hire people who were incarcerated. That is a great public signal and social proof to saying, okay, if we believe in the justice
Right.
system and the justice system has rehabilitated these people and let them go, like they should not wear a red scarlet letter, and a scarlet letter
Yeah.
and be stigmatized. So
It's interesting.
it's sort of, reconciling those two things. Like long term, I don't think college will matter. And for almost everything that we fund or do or hire here, like I don't care if you went to college or where you went to college. I care more about like your aptitude. Sometimes college is
Right.
like a heuristic for that, but more often not.
Interesting. And so now switching gears again, I guess, and building those industries for those students and those children to actually look up towards. In another podcast, you had mentioned a few areas of technology that you're most excited about. One was the rise of the GPU from gaming to powering AI. You had chronobiology, the science behind our body, and that goes into the SPAC and a lot of the bio-IT, Calliope focus that you have at Lux, and CRISPR gene editing. Could you maybe just briefly touch on some of these? And with the lens of how you get smart on a new space, when you're looking at CRISPR, when you're looking at bio-IT in a space that might be completely foreign to anything you've studied. I had spoken with a partner at 8VC, and he mentioned that the best way that he usually builds a baseline is by reading a novel on it and learning about how in fantasy, how do they think about this technology, and then uses that as a baseline for the terms that they use and developing an understanding on the science and then speaking to experts. So I'd love to hear a little bit about those areas and then maybe some of the books that you've read in those spaces, and then going into kind of what you're excited about now.
Yeah, so starting point sci-fi is definitely a huge inspiration, right? Because everything around us, everything was once imagined by somebody and then crystallized imagination. So huge believer in fiction, science fiction, because it really is just, near or far prognostications of what could be. And as long as it obeys the laws of physics, somebody will be inspired and reduce it to practice. If it doesn't obey the laws of physics, it stays in fiction, but otherwise it can, be reduced. And I've chronicled how the gap between sci-fi and sci-fact is constantly shrinking, and either our sci-fi authors are becoming less creative, which I don't believe is the case, or our scientists are becoming more creative, and they are becoming more creative because they have tools that exponentially let them discover more, right? The pace of being able to use a supercomputer to decode a virus and come up with a molecular structure so that you have a target is just like something that 50 years ago would have taken 50 years, right? Today it can take a week.
Right.
So the creativity in terms of the productivity of science and the combinatorial possibilities, which I think is one measure of creativity, which is that all new things come from combinations of old, is just super powerful. In any one of these sectors, you start to get, I guess, a few weak signals. The first thing is everybody here reads voraciously. Now, we all read different kinds of things, but I really read, obscure journals. I actually read, 5 papers in the morning. I read lots of popular magazines, and I read all of that so I can know what is everybody else reading and thinking and being influenced. And then I start to look for the variant perception in like more obscure things. And so that's everything from, blogs and Twitter, but more journalistic things that are like very niche industry stuff, so like chemical and engineering news on top of science and nature. And so I find that there's higher value in the scarcity of where there's attention. So if everybody's reading front page news, it's just like not that interesting. People might debate it, but I'm more interested in the thing in a major publication on C22 that has been given very small editorial area, and I might actually have a different weight of the importance or the magnitude of what that is, and so that's like a signal to me. In the same way that somebody that's like not reading, some obscure journal, I think that there's higher value there. And so it's amazing actually how many times I read something, I'm like, oh my God, this is absolutely incredible, and I reach out to the principal investigator or the scientist, and I'm like, I'm sure you're getting inundated. They're like, no, actually, you're the first person that's ever, called or whatever. And so that's always very validating, right? Then I take a breath. I'm like, okay, I have a little bit of time, to more further develop the thesis.
I'm not seeing your cynicism play out in those scenarios.
No, well, no, there's no
getting excited about.
In the people who are in pursuit of science, like you might be cynical, or I might be cynical in my interpretation of why they're motivated to pursue, discovery and invention, which I think is like a very ego gratifying, status seeking thing. And you might say, well, that's not morally virtuous, or you might have an Ayn Rand view that's like, oh, well, there's a virtue of selfishness. But the pursuit of science and technology and truth, unless they're frauds, is a very virtuous thing. But I'm just more skeptical about like what the true motives of people are. That just doesn't go with what everybody else thinks. Like, oh, this great virtuous, pursuit of I want to save the world, is usually BS. So, any one of those sectors, like you take nuclear waste or brain machine interfaces. Like we knew nothing about these spaces, and then you do these deep dives. Now, how do you do the deep dives? You read voraciously. and then you start talking to people. Now, the best and most rewarding aspect of this, and I literally create star maps for me just as a visual thinker. And so I've used a variety of different programs for this, but it's basically like a brain mapping thing. I've used Poplet. Now sometimes I'll just draw it on like Notability on the iPad. But the central conceit is, I start with one person, and then like I sort of make the star map of dovetail of like the two people that I've asked, like who are the smartest people in space. And then what's interesting is I might get a high signal around somebody, and then I talk to somebody else, and then they will completely dissuade me, almost like this adversarial learning in like the weighting of a neural net. And they will say, no, he's totally full of shit. And I'll be like, wait, what? And they'll be like, oh yeah, like everybody knows that he's full of shit. And I'll be like, what? So then I have to sort of back propagate the weightings that I've given to that guy and be like, okay. And so there's been a bunch of instances like that in the company Variant, which started with Professor X, who was able to spot mutants in sci-fi, and I said, 7.5 billion people on Earth, 1 in a billion chance of some crazy phenotype existing in real life. Like, what if there really are outlier mutants, who have really interesting phenotypes that are expressed in monogenic conditions? And so, I go around and talk to all these people. There were a handful of people that I was about to start this company around. And then I got sort of negative feedback from a few people who I really respected. They're like, no, those people are full of shit. I was like, oh. And so, you shift, direction. And I found that really useful. So that to me, when I get like an inkling around an area, is like that foraging, that exploration is just very exciting. You probably hear it even in my voice as I talk about this. And then it becomes almost like a Hollywood script where you're sitting around and putting together the pieces, like as a producer, of like, who's my starring protagonist, and how do I recruit her, and who's the lead board member, and how much do we need to put in, and what are they going to accomplish, and what does the next syndicate look like? And so putting together the budget and the film, and the sort of the treatment, so to speak, I find no different than somebody that might be like launching a pilot for a new TV show or something like that, except it's real. And
it's very interesting. Right.
So that's a lot of fun. But getting smart is really just reading, putting out conjectures. Sometimes I float ideas publicly, whether on Twitter or podcasts. Sometimes I get confirming evidence or disconfirming evidence, and there's been a bunch of things where I've had very high enthusiasm and unfortunately gotten disconfirming evidence. And in the interest of internally being intellectually honest, I've had to let go or abandon those ideas.
Interesting. I know we're almost out of time, so I wanted to, Kelvin Beacham, who was on the series also, I think a good friend of yours. Maybe he's also a mutant with just advanced ability, but he asked me to ask you specifically about your note taking and what platforms.
I'm not going to take his substitution on the field. If that's what he's asking.
Yeah, right.
Keep me off
He's
the
already
field.
tapped me in for that, right? But he was asking about your note taking and what platforms you use to do so and why. And he threw an LOL after that when he sent it. So I guess there's some inside joke here.
Yeah, right now Rome research, and it's really interesting because just as I was describing this process of like back propagation of a network, like I actually find the backlinking to be just super useful. That particular company has, quite literally like a cult following, and so you're getting a lot of really interesting developers that are playing with it and tweaking it, and it had a relatively high entry bar, which I sort of appreciated because I thought like, okay, if there's something really valuable here, it's almost a competitive advantage for me, and sort of knowledge management and exploration. Historically, I used Evernote. I tried Notion. I never got onto it. So I, got a ton in Evernote historically. A ton in Rome. I read and save things through Pocket, and then within Pocket I highlight, then export those into Rome, and then we'll review highlights. I do physical note taking and notability. Particularly, I do think that there's a visual memory when you're actually writing things and sort of remember in the same way that sometimes I almost read all my books on Kindle, but I do lose the sort of topographic memory when you remember that something was on the top left or top right of a page, or you're writing in the margins. So yeah, but I take a lot of notes, and I would say I'm less organized in the note taking, and so I really value the sort of automatic discovery, or tagging that some of these programs or systems have.
Okay, great. Well, Josh, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This was very insightful.
My pleasure, man. Yeah, great questions.
Thank you.